going to be talking again tonight about the question, where is God when it hurts? I think this is kind of a universal experience like we talked about last week. I want to review for just a minute, and then I'm going to cover some other material to go on with this process we're talking about. Last week we talked about the fact that we all experience even small moments and larger seasons of trials and suffering and loss and hurt. And we talked about how those times are quite contrary to what we really want, right? Nobody really wants pain. It's inconvenient. Suffering doesn't fit with our schedules. But it is what happens in our lives many times. We would much rather have the stroll in the park with the birds singing, the sun shining, money in the bank, fattening foods on the table, right? But that's not always our experience, is it? Life just hits us right between the eyes sometimes. You know, people have a whole lot of different kinds of ideas and theories about pain and suffering. We talked a little bit about some of those last week. But the whole thing is that those theories and those beliefs really become irrelevant in times of suffering. It's not a theoretical issue at that point. It really becomes a relationship issue. And so we have to look at it. You know, in those times, we want to love God and we want to understand what's going on, but many times we can't see past our own fear. We can't see past our own doubts in those times. And those times become a real crisis of faith, many times where we begin to question, why me? Why is this happening? We spend a lot of time and effort trying to look at the backward-looking question of why. We try to understand why this is happening. But what we have to begin to do in reality is ask the forward-looking question, to what end? What is going to be the result of me going through this difficult time? How can I grow from this? What can I do through this where I will come out better on the other side of it? But it takes the right perspective to be able to do that. And that's what we're really trying to look at here and what we're talking about. The truth is that we are on this earth to learn to be more like Jesus. This sin nature that we're born with so wants to be in control. It wants to take charge of things and be in control. But God can use these difficult times in our lives to remold us and to remake us if we allow him to do that. These are the times really of being on the potter's wheel. You all know this scripture, I'm sure, Jeremiah 18:3-4 says, "Then I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he wrought a work at the wheels. And the vessel that he made of clay was marred in the hands of the potter. So he made it again another vessel, as seemed good to the potter to make it." So even in the times of being in the hands of the potter, things happen to hurt us or to mar the vessel in its way. But when we begin to ask to what end, it can begin to be a time of productive, creative suffering in our lives. So we began to talk about that last week, creative suffering or productive suffering. Jesus said in John 16:33, "I have told you these things so that in me ye may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world." So he's telling us that we can have peace. He's putting trouble and peace, even in the same verses here, the same words that he's saying. We can have peace even in the midst of trouble. He says we can take heart, or we can have courage, or we can walk without fear. You know, the word courage is very interesting to me because we have the form of encourage. In other words, I can come over here and I can encourage you. I can give you courage by what I say. But I can also come over here and I can discourage, or I can take away your courage. And so what we need to know is that we can have courage in this world because Jesus is with us. And when we take heart, we will end up being able to overcome the world, which means our flesh ways and the world's way of doing things. Paul also connected grieving and hoping together. Thessalonians 4:13, 1 Thessalonians 4:13 says that ye sorrow not, even as others which have no hope. He's saying, don't sorrow in this life as if you have no hope, because you do have hope in me. Because we have hope in him, we can experience and respond to sorrow in a different way. And that, to me, is what is an incredible witness to other people, to non-believers. When we go through the same kinds of experiences that they go through, but we're able to do it in a very different way. To be able to walk through situations of pain and loss with the goal of it being creative or productive in our lives, we have to look at things from God's perspective and not through the eyes of our human reasoning. We have to be able to see from his perspective. I'm sure it'll come as no surprise to you, although it might be a little disappointing. There's no easy 1, 2, 3 steps or no cookbook formula for going through these times in our lives. I usually tell people when they come into my office for counseling, I say, I don't have a magic wand. That's what we want. You know, we want things to happen quickly. But by the time people usually drag themselves into a counselor's office, they've piled up years and years of things that haven't been taken care of and haven't been resolved. And so that has accumulated a lot of stuff and wreckage in their lives. So it's just more difficult when we don't process through things as they happen in our lives. Grief tempts us to walk alone. And that's exactly what the enemy wants us to do. Satan wants to isolate us in the darkness, and that way he can plant seeds of doubt in our minds. He can plant that fear. He can discourage us when he isolates us. He says, don't let anybody know what you're going through. What would people think if they knew about this? Don't spoil your witness now. Think about your reputation. So he brings those kinds of things up to us to try to keep us back so that we don't get connected. In times of crisis, we need connection, not disconnection. So we looked at the 2 levels of suffering, or faith trials, last week. Level 1 suffering, that's basically what happens around us and to us. We lose our job, our kids get sick, somebody criticizes us, says something rude to us, a husband or wife leaves us, a loved one dies. Level 1 suffering is what happens around us. And all suffering in some one way or another is about death. Since life is about connection, and God created us to be relational, that life is connection. When there's death, that's separation or disconnection. And because suffering and death are meant to teach us our need, again, in 2 Corinthians 1, 8 and 9, Paul writes this, For I would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch as we despaired even of life. But we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God, which raiseth the dead. That's Paul's perspective on it. So in suffering, God is not getting back at us. He's getting us back to himself. He's giving us an opportunity to get back to him. And that's such a huge statement to me. You know, so many times we think, well, is God punishing me for something? We talked a little bit about that last week. But that's not how he operates. He's giving us an opportunity to come back to him or to get closer to him during these times in our lives. The suffering we experience actually opens our hands to God. When we operate in the flesh as though we're in charge and we know it all, we are indeed in trouble. but the suffering gives us the opportunity to know that he is God and we are not. Level 2 suffering then is what happens in us. Level 2 suffering is how we face what we're dealing with. Now, suffering is not only what happens to us, but even more importantly, it's what happens in us in those times. It's what's going on in our mind that gives rise to that fear and to that doubt that we have. Much of level 1 suffering, we don't have any control over. These things that happen to us. But level 2 suffering, that's where we have our free choice. That's where it's really important, because what we choose will make all the difference in the world in where we end up in this. The doubts that we endure when we are in this casket of suffering can lead to a break in our relationship to God, a break in our relationship with other people, and even with ourselves. And we end up feeling abandoned and betrayed and ashamed. And we end up just as miserable as Job was in those circumstances. So tonight, I want to look briefly at a process that, if we learn to do this well, it will allow us to experience a loving God even in the midst of these times of suffering. What do we do when we're assaulted on every side, inside and out? How are we supposed to survive, much less thrive, when we're overwhelmed? Have you ever been in a time of suffering or loss where you've just felt overwhelmed completely? How do we do this? And that's what we're going to be talking about here. Has anybody ever heard of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross? She was a Swiss psychiatrist, and she wrote a book called On Death and Dying that was published in 1969. And out of that book came what were called the 5 stages of grieving. And they are basically taught as Bible for the whole process of how we handle suffering in our lives. And so here are the 5 stages that she identified. So she collected a lot of data on thousands of people, and these are what she came up with as the typical grief responses that people have during these times of loss and suffering. The first one is denial. That's the shock reaction. I can't believe this is happening. Oh no, it can't be true. And we refuse to believe what's happened. Number 1 is denial. The second is anger. And that's where resentment can grow. Why me? Why my child? What did I do to deserve this? And we blame God, we blame other people, we blame ourselves. The third stage is bargaining. So we try to make a deal with God. We play let's make a deal, trying to get him to do things the way we want them done. God, if you heal my child, I'll never take a drink again. And we do that kind of bargaining to try to manipulate the situation here. The next stage then is depression. And it says, yes, me, this has happened. And we finally find the courage to admit our loss, and it will either lead us to a healthy sense of sadness and grieving, or it will lead us to a sense of depression and hopelessness. Those are our choices there. And then the last stage is the stage of acceptance, where it's time we face our loss, we reflect, we begin to regroup, and we go, okay, this is what it is. What do I do now? And those are the 5 stages. That's what I learned in my degree program. And people, they teach that people go through these stages, sometimes in a little bit different order, take different amounts of times in each of the stages, sometimes go back and forth. In other words, we have our own unique experience of these stages. But here's the kicker with this. Research of fallen man only tells us typically what fallen man does. It can never tell us what should happen. So these observations only give us, it can only see us in our fallen state, because that's what we are, how we are. But only God's word can tell us how things are supposed to be. And so we have 2 basic options when we're facing suffering in this world. We can do it the world's way, or we can do it God's way. And that's our goal here. We wanted to discover a biblical sufferology, if you will, a ology of suffering and how to do it well. I have a handout here if I could get a couple of people to help me with this. Gloria, can you do that? Hand some of them out so they can hand them out. Thank you. So as she hands this out, or we get it back to you, this is basically the flow of the process that we're going to be talking about here and that I've been talking about in our class. We talked about the level 1 suffering, the external suffering. We just talked about level 2 suffering, the internal suffering. And so we're going to go through. You see what we have done on this chart is we've taken Kubler-Ross's stages, her stages, 5 stages, as the typical grief response, and then we're going to look at the biblical grief response. What does God actually ask of us to do in those circumstances so that we don't get stuck in the world's way of doing things and we can actually produce some growth here. We can have some healing and some growth through these different stages. So God says it's possible to go beyond just accepting. Her 5th stage is acceptance. Okay, this has happened, what do I do now? But God actually says we can go beyond that. We don't have to carry acceptance like a heavy weight around all the time. We can get to the fact of accepting what has happened, but we don't have to stay there. That's what's so wonderful about when we do it God's way. We can go past that to a place of hope and healing. Truth is that grieving and growing are messy because that's just how life is. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. Sometimes it's 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards. It's not a straight line. It's just think of a maze that has different ways and paths and detours and backtracking and that kind of thing. So sometimes that's what it's like to go through this whole process. But that's just part of the process. We can't cut corners when it comes to this whole process because there's a purpose in every single part of it. So in every step of it, as we go through it, God provides everything that we need. We have His Word, we have His Spirit, we have His people, our family of God. And through those things, we have everything that we need to go through these healing journeys and do what we need to do. So let's begin with looking at the 4 stages of hurt here in the sustaining and suffering. It says it's normal to hurt and necessary to grieve. That's just a part of life. Now, again, we have a tendency, especially with Satan's encouragement, to isolate ourselves when tragedy occurs in our lives. We want to isolate. We want to retreat. We don't want to be around other people. We don't want to be seen. We want to hide. But to do this God's way, we have to essentially draw a line in the sand and say, there's no retreat here. I'm not going to do that. That's how we begin to sustain, to learn to sustain, to stand. Sustain means to strengthen or support physically or mentally, to comfort, help, assist, encourage, support, to sustain, to stay with the suffering. So we refuse to allow ourselves or allow people around us to suffer alone. See, this isn't all just about how we respond in our own times of suffering, but it's also about how do we respond when our brother and sister are suffering. How do we do that and stay connected and help them through these times? Because that's part of what we're called to do. The truth is that shared sorrow is endurable sorrow. Isolated sorrow is not very endurable. So let's look first at stage 1, candor. And that's moving from denial to honesty with myself. Research says that a person's first response in these situations is denial. I remember getting a call 25 years ago from my youngest brother, and he said, Dad has had a stroke and it doesn't look good. You need to get here as soon as possible. And I remember my first response, no, I don't believe that. How could that be happening? He's a picture of health. What's going on here? I didn't want to believe it. But the fact is, denial is God's grace for a time to allow us to adjust to a different reality, to adjust to a circumstance that doesn't fit with our sense of how things should be. And so initially, denial is God's grace. But after a time, that becomes counterproductive. Some people try to stay in denial, and that doesn't work very well. I used to work with a young woman who had, for many years, been an alcoholic, and she said, her father was as well, she said, my family lived on Denial Drive. She said, the whole family lived there, and she was right. So first we have this denial response that allows us time to adjust to something's different here. But to walk toward finding hope in the situation, we need to move past that denial to a place of biblical candor. Now, candor isn't a word that we normally use every day, right? So candor, by definition, says courageous truth-telling to myself about life in which I come face to face with the reality of my external and my internal suffering. In other words, I begin to look honestly at what's going on out here, and I begin to look honestly at what's going on in here. So we begin to accept the reality of the circumstances, and we're in touch with our internal reaction to it as well. Here's an example of biblical candor. You'll recognize it when you hear it. Psalm 42, 3 through 5. David practices a lot of candor in the Psalms. He says, my tears have been my food day and night, while men say to me all day long, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I used to go with the multitude, leading the procession to the house of God with shouts of joy and thanksgiving among the festive throng. Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why so disturbed within me? So he's honest here about what's going on externally, but he's also very honest about what's going on inside himself. He recognizes that. We could look at other examples of biblical candor. We could read verse after verse after verse from Psalms and Job and Jeremiah and Solomon and Asaph and Heman and Jesus and Paul and many more. There are many times verses in the Bible are very raw with people's experience of pain. They have a frankness and an honesty here in their talking about what's going on. And they all convey the same message. It's necessary and normal to hurt and to grieve. That's what we have to do. So as we talk here about getting to a place of biblical candor, there's something I want to add here that I think is really important, because many times we have difficulty kind of recognizing what's going on inside of ourselves. A lot of us, like myself, did not grow up in families that talked the language of feelings. You had them, you just didn't talk about them. And since we're created in the image of God, we've all got feelings. You can see in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, our God is a very feeling God. But we weren't born with labels on these feelings like, oh, this is sadness. Oh, this is happiness. Oh, this is joy. We don't have labels on them. So we need to practice and know how to do that. If we didn't get that as children, then we're in the position of having to learn to do it as adults. So, at any rate, this whole idea of having candor, being honest with ourselves, can be a little bit more difficult if we've not been raised learning how to do that. They talk about IQ, which is you could take a test and you get this number to tell you how smart you are. Well, there's also something that's called emotional IQ. Have any of you heard of that? There's a big thing about that, emotional IQ. And what they've discovered is that only 20% of our success is due to our IQ, of how smart we are. 80% of our success is due to our emotional IQ. And there are 5 factors that are included in this emotional IQ. Number 1 factor is self-awareness, and that's being aware of what's going on inside of us. Being able to recognize feelings, being able to put names to them and recognize them and be able to express them. Self-awareness. The second one is mood management. Do you ever wake up in the morning in a bad mood and you just kind of thought you had to wait till it sort of left? It just came on and now it's just going to leave? Well, emotional IQ allows us, if we have a good sense of this, to manage our moods. We have a bad mood, it doesn't have control of us. We can have control of it. The third factor is self-motivation, being able to motivate ourselves. As parents, with our little kids, we are their external motivators. To go to bed, to do this and do that, and learn how to do that. But our goal is to help them learn how to be internally motivated so that they take on their own set of disciplines. Some people still, as adults, only respond to external motivations. But good emotional IQ is that you're able to motivate yourself. The fourth one is impulse control. And that's being able to control our impulses. When, the flesh wants what it wants when it wants it, right? But being able to control those impulses has to do with how well we are in the emotional IQ level. Here was a study that was done. This group of researchers went into the school in the second grade class. And they said to these second graders, so they were probably 6, 7 years old, they said, "We have marshmallows. And if you will wait 20 minutes, you can have 2 marshmallows. But if you don't want to wait, that's fine, and you can have 1 marshmallow." And so, of course, some kids just reached out right then and got their 1 marshmallow. But others of the kids waited. Now, can you imagine how long 20 minutes is to 6 or 7-year-old? But they waited the 20 minutes and they were able to get 2 marshmallows. And so they charted all of this. Years later, 14 years or so later, they went into the same school system and tracked these same students down. And what they found was a correlation between the ones who grabbed the 1 marshmallow were the dropouts, were the kids who were in trouble with drugs, had relationship problems, all of that kind of thing. The kids who had waited and got the 2 marshmallows were the leaders in the school. They were the ones with the better grades. They were the ones that were highly regarded, the head of the student body, captain of the football team, all of that kind of thing. And it related to their ability to control their impulses. The last factor, the 5th factor, is people skills. Being able to connect with and resource other people when we need them in our lives, in our relationships. They did another study, a different they, of course, but they went to Bell Laboratories in the Chicago area. It's a scientific research kind of thing, and it's full of brainiacs. It's full of people that have high IQs. But what they found is some of them were successful there and some of them were not. And as they studied that, what they discovered was those who were successful knew how, when they needed help, whether it had to do with the job or it had to do with something personal, they knew how to reach out to other people, to resource and connect with other people. The ones who did not do well were ones who isolated themselves and pulled themselves away. So I just wanted to share that because to me that's so important in looking at this whole idea of candor. Because if we have a good emotional IQ, it's going to be an easier task for us. But if we're not very self-aware, if we don't manage our moods or ourselves very well, we don't control our impulses, and we don't know how to relate to other people, we're going to have more difficulty with this. And that means, to me, there's some work to be done, okay? So that's a part of looking at this whole idea of candor. And how do we do that well? So I'm a firm believer that God will give us every opportunity that we need to do things His way and in a way that benefits us and grows us the most. So if suffering is what it takes and we don't do it His way and we don't get creative or productive with it, guess what? He'll give us another opportunity to suffer so we can learn to do it the right way, His way. So when Paul is talking about grieving and hoping, he's saying that grief is the grace of recovery because mourning slows us down to face life and to begin to know ourselves and manage ourselves better. In other words, he's saying Paul didn't know the term emotional IQ, but what he's saying here is that suffering allows us the opportunity to develop in that area so that we can be better at it. And he says no grieving, N-O, no grieving, no healing. But also no grieving, K-N-O-W, no healing. If we grieve properly, we will also heal because we have hope. So candor or denial, that's a choice point and turning point in and of itself. But getting to a place of candor is not the end of the journey. It's just the beginning. And actually that can be maybe one of the hardest places for people because just stepping out on that trail can be kind of scary sometimes. What's going to happen? What will I feel? Will I be able to handle it? What's going to happen here? What's going to go on? But it's definitely worth it because it allows us to move to the next stage to know where we need to be. And the second stage then is that of complaint or a lament for your loss. Anger is the typical second stage of the world's way of doing things, getting angry. We've recognized what happened. We don't like it. It interfered with our agenda and our plan, and we're mad. Now, here's where it can get very confusing for those of us who are Christians, because we love God and we know that He loves us, and we know that He is good, but suddenly life has turned bad. And so it becomes a question, how do we reconcile those two things? How do we reconcile a good and loving God with the bad and the wickedness that is suddenly now in our lives in some form or fashion? And we're not even sure sometimes that we should ask that question. We're not even sure that it's safe to ask that question. What would He say if we did ask? Do we dare put our complaint into words and direct it toward God? If you look at the scriptures, you'll see that they are very clear that God invites and welcomes lament and complaint. Think of the many Psalms, Jeremiah, Lamentations, and on, where there's some very intense lamenting going on. Now, but we think, do I dare talk to God like that? Those of us who have read Numbers 11:1 know that the the Israelites were in the wilderness and they started grumbling and complaining because they didn't have their cucumbers and leeks and all that kind of stuff that they'd been used to eating. They didn't have that anymore. So they were complaining. God got angry. He sent a fire and they all became crispy critters. So that doesn't exactly encourage you to start the complaint, does it? But there's a distinction here. There's something that's very different. There's a difference between the sinful complaint of the Israelites in the book of Numbers and the godly complaint or the lament of people like Job or Jeremiah and many of the others. The Israelites were complaining about God. You done me wrong. Why did you do that? They were complaining about God. And all what they were seeing was that they didn't have the food that they wanted to eat, and it was God's fault. But there is biblical complaint, and that complains to God about the fallen world and the experiences that we're having. That's very different. So ungodly complaint complains about God and what we think he's done wrong, or that he's lacking in wisdom or holiness or power or any of those kinds of things. So how do we do biblical complaint here? In candor, we're honest with ourselves. In biblical complaint, we are honest with God. Complaint is a vulnerable frankness about life to God in which I express my pain and confusion over how a good God allows evil and suffering. Once we study it and look at it, there are far more psalms of complaint and lament than psalms of praise and thanksgiving. Complaints are actually faith-based acts of persistent trust. In complaint, we don't hide anything from him about how we're feeling about things because we know that he's good and we trust his good heart. And we know that he knows our hearts. In Psalm 62:8, it says, "Trust in him at all times, ye people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us." Selah. It says stop and think about that. God is a refuge for us. Talk to him honestly about your experience. Biblical complaint allows us to talk to him about what's going on in our lives, externally, internally, that we're confused about, that we don't understand, but we trust him in it. The biblical genre of complaint expresses frankness and honesty about the reality of life that seems inconsistent with the character of God. When we complain, we live in the real world honestly, refusing to ignore what's occurring. There is no elephant in the middle of the living room that nobody is talking about. The closer we are able to get to God, the more we will see things from his perspective. Spiritual friendship with God brings 20/20 spiritual vision from God. But the farther away we are from him, the less we can see things from his perspective, and the more we see things through our human reasoning and our human eyes, rather than with faith. In complaint, we come to God with a sense of abandonment and confusion. Isaiah said in 49:14, "But Zion said, the Lord hath forsaken me, and my Lord hath forgotten me." Jeremiah wrote in 27, "O Lord, thou hast deceived me, and I was deceived. Thou art stronger than I am, and hast prevailed. I am in derision daily. Everyone mocketh me." So they're talking honestly about their experience. They're not blaming him for it. They're just saying, this is how I'm experiencing what's going on. And in those passages, it looks like just by reason alone that life is bad and so is God. But in each of those instances and every other one, God responds positively to that expression. And but to deny or diminish suffering is to remain arrogant and refuse to be humbled by it. And remaining arrogant or blaming is to reject our dependence on God. In Deuteronomy 8:1-10, Moses chastises the Israelites for forgetting their past suffering. In verse 2, he says this, "And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou would keep his commandments or no." It says to know what was in thine heart. Now, God knows that. He knows what's in our hearts, but he wants us to know. And in these circumstances, that's what brings us to recognition, to know what is in our hearts. And sometimes it's not a very pretty picture. So at stage 2, we have the choice of destructive anger or constructive complaint or lament. Will we be disappointed with God, or will we be disappointed without God? That's basically our choice. So our next major choice point here comes at stage 3, which is bargaining and works in the world's way of looking at things. So we can start bargaining with God to try to get him to do the things that we want him to do, to make him change his mind or do what we want, basically. Or if we're willing to do things his way, rather than trying to bargain or play let's make a deal, what that means is that we begin to cry out to him for help. We surrender control of our lives to God. We quit playing games and we cry out. Crying out is a plea for him to work on our behalf, because I'm admitting I can't survive without him. I'm admitting at this point, I just don't know what to do. I don't have a way of doing it. I've got to have you do something here. God, I need your help. Crying out is reaching up with open palms and pleading eyes in the midst of darkness and doubt. That to me is such a vivid picture that it brings of desperation, of need, of humility. Reaching out and looking up, God, I need your help because I'm helpless here. The Bible talks about this stage of grief in Psalm 34, 17 and 18. Here it is in the Message version. Is anyone crying for help? God is listening, ready to rescue you. If your heart is broken, you'll find God right there. If you're kicked in the gut, he'll help you catch your breath. So how many of us, as parents, when our kids came running to us and said, Mommy, I need you, help me. Didn't we just run to help them and do whatever they needed us to do and just gather them up? When we come to God like that, Daddy, I need you. I think he responds exactly the same way. And so that crying out or that reaching out is what empties us of ourselves so we have more room for him. We've given up our plan. We've given up our agenda. We're confused. We don't know what's happening or why it's happening, but we just want to know, God, I need your help. I need you here to help me. So remember here that suffering is God's primary way of uprooting our self-reliance and complacency. He uses suffering to get our attention. C.S. Lewis says, pain is God's megaphone. It's the way God gets our attention because it's our wake-up call many times. And so crying out to him is our admission that he has our attention. He's gotten our attention at this point. And so then we come to stage 4, which in the world's way is depression and alienation. That's essentially grief without hope. This is so bad, I have no hope. Things will never get better. I don't even want to live if this is going on. That's without hope. So imagine where a person is on the grief journey after the first 3 typical stages. Denial is given away to anger, which is given away to bargaining and works. You know, if God allowed our works to work, we would never surrender to him. if we could work our way into salvation, or we could work our way into getting our way, we wouldn't surrender to him. So he thwarts our attempts to manipulate him. Our attempts to make life work on our terms or to change our circumstances ourselves. He won't let us get by with having any real success on our own. So here we are in the condition of being frustrated by God. He's not letting our works work. And so he allows that so we will know that we are not self-sufficient. If we refuse to cry out to him, the typical fourth stage of grief happens, and that's depression. It's depression filled with hopelessness because we have chosen to be separated from God. We have chosen disconnection. We accept the reality of our loss, but only from an earthly perspective, and we don't see any higher plan in it. In stage 4, depending on our choices, our journey will either lead us to that depression because we've alienated and separated ourselves from God and from other people, or it will bring us to finding comfort because we're connecting with God and connecting with other people. For those who do not turn to Jesus at this time, that grief process moves from denial to anger to bargaining works and then to depression. But if we cling to Jesus through this process, we grieve with hope and we move from candor to complaint and lament to crying out to God and then to experiencing his comfort. So here we are, comfort. If we've made this choice, comfort, surviving the scars. Originally, the word comfort meant co-fortitude, meaning being fortified by the strength of another. Someone else giving us strength or giving us fortitude. So the word fortitude means courage in pain or adversity. So just as being encouraged, giving courage, it's having courage poured into you from an outside source. That's what the outside source here is, the Lord and his body of believers. That's what can bring comfort with the connection with them. In this life, your scar from whatever it is that has happened may never go away, but neither will his. Here's the definition of comfort as it's used in this fourth stage. Comfort experiences the presence of God in the presence of suffering. A presence that empowers us to survive scars and plants the seed of hope that we will yet thrive. That presence offers us mercy and it offers us help. So by the time we get to this fourth stage, we probably aren't thriving yet. In fact, most likely we may still be limping. But at least we aren't retreating because we've learned to sustain. We've learned to stick through with this process and work on through it. And by this time, we might be like the Apostle Peter. When Jesus asked his disciples, he said, "Will you too leave me?" And you know what Peter said in 67, 68? Basically, he said, where are we going to go? You have the words of eternal life. You know, if we really believe this message, there is no place else to go. God has the words of eternal life. This is the message. And so faith understands that God feels our pain. And he joins us in our pain and even shares our pain. Isaiah said this in 63, verse 9. And again, I'm going to read it in the Message. I absolutely love this verse. It said, "So he became their Savior. In all their troubles, he was troubled too. He didn't send someone else to help them. He did it himself in person." God himself came to bring comfort and to hope for us. So his sharing of our sorrow makes our sorrow endurable. Faith doesn't demand that suffering be removed. Faith asks for endurance in suffering, as well as in temptation and persecution. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says this, "No test or temptation that comes your way is beyond the course of what others have had to face. All you need to remember is that God will never let you down. He'll never let you be pushed past your limit. He'll always be there to help you come through it." Faith understands that what can't be cured can be endured. Faith delights in weakness because when we are weak, what did Paul say? That's when he is strong. That's when God can really work. When we allow ourselves to depend on him and reach out to him for his help because we've admitted our weakness. We've given away our plan. We've given away our agenda. And we're saying, God, here I am for you to work. Comfort develops through communing with the Lord, being with him, and through connection to the body of Christ. And it's because we experience that suffering as separation that shared sorrow is so vital, that we come together in our suffering to work together. Pain separates us, but our response to it can connect us in very powerful ways. So here we are essentially at the halfway point. Okay, we've gone through these first 4 stages here in the stages of hurt. And we've come to a place of experiencing comfort from the Lord and from people who are walking through the suffering with us. I will say that we need to choose the people that we walk through our suffering with carefully. And we need to surround ourselves with people that we can trust and we know have our best interests at heart too. So very briefly, I want to just go through here the second set of stages, healing and suffering, the stages of hope. You see, what has happened here is that this 5th stage of acceptance in the world's way of doing things has been separated out into four additional stages. So stage 5, I'm just talking about these just very briefly. Stage 5 is waiting, trusting in faith. That's trusting that God is going to provide what we need in the future rather than working to provide what we want for ourselves. That's trusting God. We wait, trusting on his provision rather than working ourselves to make that happen. It's refusing to take over while refusing to give up. You will never see waiting on one of the stages in the world's way of thinking. Because waiting is not a worldly concept, is it? It's just not natural in the fallen world. But the truth is that kind of waiting is really supernatural. Stage 6 then is wailing, groaning with hope. So that's where we long fervently for heaven, but we live passionately for God and for others while we're here. Groaning exposes how needy we are and keeps us in a condition of longing, thirsting, hungering for the supernatural things of God. Groaning, I want these things, I want to see these things happen in my life and other people's lives. God, I've seen how you can work. I want you to work in these ways supernaturally. Stage 7 is weaving, perceiving with grace. That's learning to entrust ourselves to God's larger purpose, his good plans, and his eternal perspective. So again, we've given up our plan, our perspective, and we're learning to look for his. We see life with spiritual eyeballs, okay, and not through our fallen human lens. We get to see things from God's perspective. And then stage 8 is worshiping, engaging with love. We get to the point where we want God more than we want relief. And we seek to find God even when we don't find answers. Some questions we have, will never be answered. We say, well, I'll find out when I get to heaven. I'm going to go march right up and I'm going to ask Jesus. But you know what? I think when we get there, we're not going to care anymore. We'll have every answer that we need at that point. Worship is walking with God in the dark and having him as the light in your soul. We may still be walking through the dark of a fallen world, but he is our light. And so each of those last 4 stages and the stages of hope we're going to be talking about in more detail through the rest of the quarter in our class. And so, right now what I wanted to do to kind of end up tonight is I wanted to give you a little bit of my personal story and how I found the answer to the question we've been asking, where is God when it hurts? And I'm going to start at the point, there are many stories here. We all have a lot of stories, I know. I had been married about 17 years. I lived in Greenville, Texas, outside of Dallas. I had 2 boys. At that point, they were 12 and 15. And I wasn't happy in my marriage. I was confused. Something was missing. I didn't know what was going on. I had not been faithful in my marriage. I went into counseling. I found a counselor. And I remember her saying, after a few sessions, she said, word for word, well, it sounds like you've already made up your mind about your marriage. And so from that point on, we just began talking about divorce and how that was going to happen. And I've often wondered, what would have happened if she said, well, it sounds like you've made up your mind about the marriage, but let's see what God says about it. But she didn't. And, it's not good to stand in the counsel of the ungodly. But I did decide to divorce. And I had this strange notion. I'm not sure why it came up, but the strange idea was that if I leave and kind of sneak out of the house and take as little as possible, maybe they won't really notice I'm gone. And so that's essentially what I did. I moved out. I moved in with the man I was having an affair with. And I reasoned with that. My husband was a much more reasonable, sane person at that point, and they were in better hands with him. But the fact is I left my children. And I remember probably a year and a half after that, I had remarried at that point. And a year and a half after that, I remember sitting on the steps of the back porch at my house. And it was Mother's Day. And I had not heard from my kids again. And I remember crying and crying and crying and crying. But I knew I deserved it. It took a lot of years for that to begin to resolve and for the relationship to begin with my sons to begin to develop again. Fast forward another 4 years. Well, let me say, in all of that, I didn't cry out to God. I didn't look to him. I didn't ask for help. I had no experience of God being a part of my life at that point. And so, again, fast forward about 4 years, I got a phone call in the middle of the night. And it said, your son's been in an accident. Meet us at the ER. And so my husband and I rushed to the hospital. And my son, who, in his response to all of this, had started drinking and clubbing and going into the gay lifestyle and doing all manner of things. And on this particular night, he'd been coming back from a night of drinking in Dallas, and he had hit a bridge alone in the middle of the night. And we don't really know how long he'd been in the wreckage before they discovered him. But when I got to the ER, he was screaming and thrashing and completely out of control. And so they basically had smelled alcohol on him, and they just thought, oh, he's this drunk kid, and not really paying a whole lot of attention to him. And as it turned out, he had a closed head injury. And at that time, this is 1983, they didn't know much about closed head injuries and some of the responses of it. And we basically had one of the doctors talking to me and my ex-husband, his dad, say, what we recommend is that you put him in a locked mental unit and just walk away and forget he's there. And I remember pointing my finger in the face of that doctor, and I said, over my dead body will I do that, because I wasn't going to leave my son a second time. By that time, my ex-husband had remarried, and it basically took all four of us, he and his wife, me and my husband, with all of the hospitals and the rehab and all of the kinds of things that we went through that experience. And through all of that, relationships began to heal. But did I cry out to God? No, I didn't. I was basically a secular humanist at that time, agnostic, atheist, depend on what time you ask me, which I was. And so I saw no purpose in that because I didn't believe in it. So fast forward another 4 years or so, and my husband, second husband, the man I decided I was going to live the rest of my life with, suddenly decided he didn't want to be married to me anymore. He'd found him another best friend. I'd been commuting from Greenville to Houston during the week working, because we were going to move to Houston, and coming back on the weekends, and while I was gone, he found him another best friend. And so at that point in my grief journey, I got to the point of depression and being suicidal. But did I cry out to God? No. And then my husband and his girlfriend, strangely enough, had started going to the Pentecostal church in Greenville. And so after a while, we'd been separated for a while, and after a while, I decided to go to the church myself to try to save my marriage. I remember at that point saying, God, I don't know if you're there or not, but if this is what it takes, and of course I meant by that to save my marriage, if this is what it takes, this is what I'll do. And the truth is, I didn't save my marriage, but I got saved. Because at that point, I finally came face to face with a God who cared, and a God who made himself so real to me. And in my suffering through all of that, by my own choices, we often bring our own suffering on ourselves. But God, again, brought around opportunity after opportunity for me to do what I needed to do. And it just took coming to the point where I realized the world as I had understood it didn't really exist. In my overeducated ignorance, I believed the world was a certain way, and it was not. And when I came face to face with God, I realized this is what was missing. This is what I'd been looking for so long. But many times we look and don't realize what we're looking for. and sometimes don't even recognize it when we first see it. The word God gave me for this year, you've heard Pastor say it earlier in the year, is healing waters. And I believe that this is a year of healing in many ways, a year of healing waters. But it's not just this year, because God gives us opportunity after opportunity to lay down before him and do what we need to do, which is say, I give up myself so that you can do in me what you want to do. And to be able to say, God, your plan is so much better than what I could ever possibly conceive. And so the answer to the question, where is God when it hurts? Look in front of you, look behind you, look to the side of you. That's where he is. He's there ready and he's waiting. And we can't let our pride, we can't let our own agendas or any of those kinds of things get in the way. I have been so affected as I've studied this process, because this isn't just about a process that we use if somebody dies or there's a divorce. There's something huge. It's a process we can use each and every day for every little thing that happens. Somebody says something rude to us or offends us in some way. We go through this process. We don't hold on to it. I've been a counselor for 36 years this month. And when people come to me, it's because they have held on. They have held on to things. They've not gone through this kind of process of recognizing and dealing with it. Many times it's because they've blamed other people or blamed God for the circumstances. And so we get stuck in those ways. But this is such a pure way of that process of letting these things just... God gave us feelings as a signal to tell us what's going on in the state of our lives, in our relationships. He gives us feelings. They're meant to be a signal. They're not supposed to come in and live. Have you ever known somebody that you would say is an angry person? Somebody who's let anger come in and stay and reside. But it's just meant to come in and flow. That's what the feelings are meant to do. And God gives us this process where we can actually give them back to him. I recognize that, God, this is what's going on. I don't like it. I don't understand it. I know that you are good and you are kind and you are loving and you want the best for me. I don't like this mess at all. And then experience his comfort and experience the growth and get to the point where we want him more than we want relief or more than we want anything else.